Toku Noa, ngā mihi nui. We've been asked to talk a little bit about wellbeing economics and, this is not one I've got, but it's all good. Wellbeing economics and the living standards framework. Ignore local government, as we all do. No, I think it'll be okay. So in 2017 we got a new government, Labour-led government, working with their coalition partner, New First, and their confidence inspired agreement partner, the Green Party. Beyond just wellbeing, and I want to talk about wellbeing economics and how the living standards framework flushes out of that, they talked through the election campaign and in the coalition agreement negotiation period in the first couple of months, saying big picture, if you want to distill it into 3 words, this government is incredibly interested in equity, the environment, and well-being. We're going to drill down on well-being. So I studied economics at university, amongst other stuff, and we were primarily, as a measure of well-being, as a measure of success for governments and economies, we focused on GDP. And GDP is the sum total of all goods and services produced in a country. It was developed in the 1930s. It's an iterative process of improving how it's measured and how it's utilised by reserve banks across the world, treasuries and governments. Common criticisms of GDP was it doesn't encapsulate the value of volunteers, and we all deal with volunteers a lot. It doesn't encapsulate the value of parenting, which is unpaid. It doesn't involve the physical exchange of money for services or goods. You can crank up GDP by pulling various levers or dampening it down. You can run down natural resources in a country and crank up GDP. It doesn't really have a sustainability aspect. There's the broken window criticism, where I could walk down Langton Quay, as I so often want to do, and break every window, and the repair costs of repairing those windows would improve GDP. Christchurch earthquake, big upward tick for GDP, despite being a tragic event. But in defence of GDP, economists have been pretty focused on it because it was the best we had, and it was really encapsulating. And when you go to third world countries and see poverty and a really, really strong correlation between improving livelihoods, improving standards of living, and GDP, it's pretty hard to think about anything else. A lot of economists spend their entire careers thinking, how do we increase GDP by 1 percentage point a year growth above our natural rate of GDP growth? Because that actually materially gives governments and economies choices, buy hospitals, buy education, buy police force, and pay for stuff. So, GDP is not a bad figure. It's just in the first world, we've kind of got to this point, led by the OECD, that we've got choices to think about other stuff. We've got choices to think about to what extent are we having sustainable GDP growth? To what extent is GDP growth shared? To what extent is economic growth shared in an equitable way? Are there a whole lot of other ways of measuring well-being for people that are not linked to GDP? So we focus on well-being. A lot of economic thought, government thought has gone into this. Well-being is really hard to measure. People have different tastes. Well-being might be different across different cultures or belief systems. You ask what well-being means to a Vanuatu, and it's very different from an Israeli. And well-being is really hard to observe. Economists are super into observable stuff, data. These are 3 distinguished economists. 2 of them have won Nobel Prizes. And these start in the 2000s and through the last, 2 decades. There's been an emerging consensus on and thought into well-being economics. And OECD has done a lot of work on this. A New Zealander called Connell Smith, who's come back to New Zealand more recently, worked for the OECD on this for a long time. They'll have to contain both objective and subjective measures. Key difference is there's well-being now, but what we do now affects the future. So we can't think about pulling a whole lot of levers, which is what's government to do, can improve well-being, if it runs down our ability to maintain that well-being. So it has a dual temporal aspect. It's got the here and now, but also the future. Whereas previously, I guess, GDP economics would focus on, let's measure how much economic growth we've had this year and worry about next year. Or didn't have many ways of worrying about the year after. So this is what the OECD came up with. Many of you work with profit and loss statements and balance sheets in your organisation, and there's something of a corollary here. This is your profit and loss statement, sort of here and now measures of well-being. Across population averages, and you have to generalise, but there's some real meaty, hard stuff you can touch there, stuff that can be measured quite accurately in terms of money, and hard stuff that you can physically touch. And then there's a whole lot of stuff that's a little bit more subjective, a bit more qualitative and hard to measure. But this is current well-being. Underpinning that is your balance sheet, your assets that you have as an organisation, the resources you have. And they've chopped that up into 4 different forms of capital: natural capital, economic capital, human capital, and social capital. I'd encourage you to go to, perhaps not the OECD website, but Treasury, our Treasury, the New Zealand Treasury, has come up with this, and it's very, very similar. The capitals are essentially the same, and there's some slight sort of semantic changes to the current well-beings, but they've come with 12 types of current well-being, which the government's seeking to manipulate and improve, obviously, and that's underpinned, and there's a two-way flow here. When we improve well-beings, the hope that it builds up our capital in the same way that if you return a surplus to your organisation, a financial surplus, you may invest it in assets, which in turn improves your ability to deliver the outputs. So this is kind of outputs, inputs, capital, assets, things that help you do stuff, and this is the stuff you're trying to do, or the government is trying to do. So, in the interest of time, I'm going to have to sort of cut it there for wellbeing economics. Next slide. It's really about people rather than the economic systems. It's outcomes rather than inputs or outputs. Inputs and outputs. Governments in the past have been really focused on, we spend X amount of money in this ministry or this project, and what do we get out in terms of output, but it's really about outcomes. It incorporates averages, obviously, you're conglomerating and averaging, and distribution becomes a part of it. GDP and other traditional measures like employment, for example, doesn't really help or doesn't really express the degree to which resources or outcomes are spread equitably or not. Contains both objective and subjective measures, and it's got that dual temporal aspect of the here and now. What's happening this year? How happy and well are we? And how well are we set up to keep delivering that sustainably in the future? So, it requires a bit of study, I guess, and you have to be pretty keen on economics to get into the history of it, as I am. But it's really compelling for our sector because I guess in the past, we all know in our bones the wonderful things we can do. Like Grant explained the week he had with those kids and those wonderful outcomes of those kids having that great week. We all know that, and we all lived that, and most of us have dedicated our professional careers to enhancing that. But it's been really hard to convey that to policymakers and decision makers, governments and funders about why we should invest in that. Because traditionally those entities have been focused on what are you doing for employment figures, what are you doing for GDP growth. But the government now is listening and in fact demanding that people express their values. Ministries and NGOs and Quangos and private sector organisations express their value at least through these terms. In New Zealand, the media has picked up on these capitals, because 4 is easier than 12. But in the here and now, the government's far more interested in hearing about what you are doing to improve the 12 well-beings. And we, the outdoor recreation sector, has a fantastic story to tell on that. This is our chance, and it's a once in a multi-generational shift in economic theory that allows us to express our value much better about what we do. And for the first time in a long time, I guess the government is thinking, or at least is listening. And that's very exciting. So why do I talk about that? around local government, they have a different version of Wellbeing. So the Local Government Act swings back and forth between left and right, and governments, and it gets amended. But you need to know that in the Local Government Act, which got amended as soon as the new government came in, the 4 well-beings are back, and this is how local government does their well-being. No, this is the wrong one. It's all good. So, what do we talk about well-being? So, speaking of change, and, generic joke there. About this time last year, I guess it was, Chris Grant, some senior leaders from our sector, 3 of them are in the room, got together and produced a document. Was this kind of a starter for 10? They got together and strategized, and it was fantastic. Really interesting day that you spent together to produce this, and I guess it was day plus and homework and time. And they showed us at Recreation Aotearoa, and we thought, this looks fantastic. Where do we go from here? And you can jump in and tell the story anytime, maybe questions at the end. But sort of how it played out was those 4 people said, oh, have a look at this. Where does this go from here? And where we took that from there was, well, first let's have a look at it. It's got a sort of desired future state, government policy that's required or desired, kind of policy prescription, what drivers would need to achieve this desired future state, and a bunch of KPIs. Pretty good model. Really, some really good stuff in there. Our next step was to take those 4 people, put them in a room again with a facilitator, and add a slightly expanded group. And if you're in this room, you could have easily been in that room. It's just we ran out of chairs. We wanted to invite many people that I can see around the room. This is Fleur Pawsey. She won the Adventure Racing World Champs last year. She works at Canterbury University. She's an academic. That's Nigel Muir, the CEO of Sport Tasman. Probably the RST that's the most kind of outdoor recreation focused, we would say. Dr. Mike Boyes, which many of you probably studied under at Otago, when he entered the room late, everyone sort of sat up straight because he was their old lecturer. Jill Ratt, the chair of Enzoya. Rob McLean used to be the director of Outward Bound, a few other things. That's Arthur Clapp. He's got a long background in snow sports, adventure racing, multi-sport, and event management, big scale outdoor rec event management. That's Ashley Peters, exciting young instructor in the mountain bike world, a leader in the mountain biking world, and my boss, Andrew Leslie, which was me this morning. And where it kind of went from there, where did it go from there? Discussed it. Everyone was in broad agreement that we need to come up with what we determined would be a policy manifesto, and it's kind of this 2.0, I guess. It's pan-sector. It's not owned by any given organisation. It's certainly not a Recreation Aotearoa strategy. We've got our own. Every organisation who will be involved, or you're all welcome to be involved, has their own strategy, of course. It's kind of owned by the sector, not owned by the government perhaps, but a description of the value of our world, and some ideas about how we might improve our sector. And I've got some copies of sort of, if starter for 10 was that one I just showed you that the 4 came up with, this is perhaps a starter for 20 maybe, next step. I would encourage you to all have a quick flick through. So it has 4 parts at this stage. Sorry, no. I sent it to you. Word document. The first part is kind of, and it was written initially by me. So that group kind of delegated to RA, Regression, Aotearoa, and myself to kind of pull this together. And I consulted with a lot of people and got some feedback and some assistance from Chris and Annie and Dr. Mike Boyes. That first part, which is really, first part is a qualitative, subjective appeal to a description of why our world is great. And Dr. Mike Boyes wrote a lot of that, which is good. Section 2, which was a lot of it was Chris Knowles' work, was that diagram how funding has changed. We saw a bit of that in Grant's presentation today, how funding, despite participation growing in outdoor rec, participation's gone up and out and bigger, and funding has got smaller. So it's just explaining that disconnect between central government funding and what people are actually doing, and a bit of the history of which again Grant referenced this morning. Section 3, and this is why I'm talking about the Living Standards Framework, because we've received advice from Connell Smith, who's the sort of godfather of wellbeing economics, happens to be a New Zealander living in Wellington, is we are beholden, and anyone is beholden to talk to the government in terms through that prism of those 12 wellbeings. So we've expressed with a whole lot of academically verified, deeply researched and unquestionable benefits of outdoor recreation expressed through those 12 well-beings. The advice we got was don't try to solve all the world's problems by improving all 12 well-beings. Pick on 3 or 4, but I just couldn't. Outdoor rec contributes to so many more than just 3 or 4 well-beings. Outdoor rec probably does get pretty close to solving all the world's problems if we did it at scale. So I couldn't strip it back to one and really relax into. And then the final part, apart from the references at the back, which I'm pretty happy to leave out, pending advice, probably from Dr. Mike Boyce, is policy prescriptions. And that's really the weakest part at the moment, and that's where we really need your help. I mean, I'll take advice. This is not my document, it's not Regression Aotearoa's, it's hopefully ours. About take advice on the structure or the content of everything else, but at the moment that policy prescription part is just some ideas. Some of them good, some of them pretty outrageous, some of them pretty niche, some of them pretty big picture, but we really need your help to pad that out. Pad that out's probably not the right term, but come up with your thoughts about what government is doing that's slowing you down, or what government could do to speed you up. What's getting in the way of what you do, and what could the government help with by accelerating? Yeah, I probably don't even need that other than to invite Chris, Fiona and Grant, who were the genesis of this idea, to add their thoughts or context or advice, direction. But at the very least I'd like for you to get in touch, maybe get a copy of this. Please keep it to yourself. We don't want this to get out prematurely. But yeah, write on that paper copy or send me emails with advice or comments or queries. But just like to affirm that it's not my document, it's not my employer's document. The effort and the direction we got from those original kaumātua was to make this a pan sector that we can all buy into. And I guess my perspective is least, there's the power in logos and endorsements. I don't think every organisation will be passionate about every particular policy prescription or every policy or regulation idea or spending commitment. But as long as you can see your place in it and don't disagree, forcefully disagree with parts of it, then you're in a position to endorse it. And that's really, really powerful. If we got 20 or 30 logos on the bottom of this, and the potential's 80. That's very, very powerful when you take it to government, and each organisation could take it to government or policymakers or regulators and say, well, actually, it's not just me that thinks this. There's actually 20, 30, 80 other organisations that agree with us, and that's very, very powerful. So that, from my perspective, that's my wish. But, Grant, Chris, Fiona.
I'll start. My driver has been for some time to have one of these, a new one, and any process that can drive that is what I'm very keen on trying to push forward. And for those of you who don't know who I am, I'm the General Secretary, National Chief Executive of YMCA, which is a very large provider of active recreation, possibly the largest in the country, I would think. We're certainly bigger than regional sports trusts. We are a significant player, but we are one of only 3 NROs, National Recreation Organisations, left being funded by Sport New Zealand, we get $180,000 a year from Sport New Zealand. If we were a regional sports trust, we'd be getting well over $1 million, easily. And like I've been around, for those of you who know me, I've been around a long time. And Mike talks about change, and the quote I'd give is that the French one that goes plus ça change, plus ça la même chose. The more things change, the more they stay the same. And that's where we are in the outdoors. I think we are exactly where we were 20 years ago when this came out. So that's my driver. And I've met with Grant Robertson now twice, and I'm pushing really hard for this. And I'm really keen on the leadership of RA.
Coordination
To take it forward, and I'll do whatever's necessary to help drive that along.
Fiona, any perspectives, advice, and call to action?
I would just support Sam's call for people to really get involved with this and give feedback, because for us, Eon's goes to talk to the ministry ahead, to know that the same message and the same material is Sporting Z, Grant Robertson, it all makes a big difference to have the same basis and message out there. All of our parts will be different, as Sam said, but to have that agreed message is really powerful. But RA is just facilitating it. Poor old Sam, I feel, is behaving. So we need to step up and do our bit.
The only thing I'd add is I believe that the only chance we have to make a difference is by collaborating together, and that is having a shared message and a shared value proposition. And we've operated from a deficit model in the past where we all compete over some crumbs that are rolled out to us, rather than actually saying together we've got a really incredible value proposition. It needs proper funding, and this is what we can do, and we should all be measured by that. So that's the opportunity to do it, rather than just look at your own little patch.
Cool. Thanks, Ben. All I can say is get in touch, please contribute. It'd be great.